Hello, K-Squid listeners. It's every other Sunday again. And we are your hosts, Brooke, Wright, and Ronnie Lipschutz. And you're listening to Sustainability Now, a bi-weekly K-Squid radio show focused on environment, sustainability, and social justice in the Monterey Bay region, California, and the world. Our guest today is Dr. Ahmad Faruqui, who recently retired from the Brattle Group and describes himself as an economist at large. He's an energy economist whose career has been focused on the efficient use of electricity by consumers. He's worked on a broad range of topics, including forecasting, designing programs around energy efficiency, designing electricity rates to optimize the use of scarce resources, assessing the impact of new technologies, such as energy-efficient equipment, electric cars, solar panels, and battery energy storage. He's also a defense policy analyst, especially with respect to his native land, Pakistan. Tonight, we're going to talk about an impending decision at the California Public Utilities Commission, which is going to may affect the rate at which solar homeowners are getting paid for the electricity that they put into the grid. Dr. Faruqui, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, very much so. Thank you.
Good. May I call you Ahmad?
Yes, by all means.
Okay, well, I want to welcome you to Sustainability Now. We've organized the show today into 4 parts. First, we're going to talk about net energy metering, how it began, and what were the goals of the policy. Second, what are the benefits to California and the electricity grid of rooftop solar? And why are claims being made that net energy metering represents a shift of costs from lower-income electricity customers to wealthier ones? Third, what is the content of the proposed decision coming before the California Public Utilities Commission in the near future? Where did it come from? Who's behind it? Who opposes it? And finally, what do we need to do to make sure that California reaches its electrification and renewable energy goals in a financially fair form? And what could happen if the PUC approves the proposed decision? Now, I hope many of our solar nerd colleagues are listening, but we want to keep the discussion aimed at lay people who may not be familiar with the industry and all of the policy jargon. That okay?
Yes, certainly. I'll do my best.
All right. So why don't we start with the big question? What is net energy metering?
Net energy metering is a program that sort of began sometime in the mid-90s in California. It is also now available in roughly half the states in the U.S. And in a nutshell, what it does is it sets the same price for buying power from the grid as it does for selling power back to the grid. Now, perhaps I should indicate that most people just buy power from the grid. It's a one-directional relationship that they have with the grid. However, once they install solar panels, they produce energy as well as consume energy. And usually the amount they produce is more than sufficient for certain hours of the day to meet their needs. They have a surplus. And that typically happens around somewhere between noon and 2 p.m., depending on which month of the year we are talking about. So they're buying power for several hours from the grid, and during most probably the early afternoon to mid-afternoon hours, they're selling the surplus that they cannot consume back to the grid. So what net energy metering did, it said you will buy and sell at the same price. It was a pretty simple concept. That's basically the gist of net energy metering. And the reason it was initiated, at least the stated reason that states have given, is to encourage customers to adopt rooftop solar and install it on their homes. It has been around, as I said, for a while, and it certainly has had a positive influence in stimulating solar adoption by customers. However, at some point, when we had a number of solar panels, and right now in California we have 1.3 million solar panels. So at some point back in the year 2016, a change was proposed in net energy metering. And that change resulted in something called Net Energy Metering 2.0, or let's just call it NEM 2. And what NEM2 did was address some of the concerns that some parties had begun to voice. The concern was the solar customers were reducing their energy usage by such a large amount that the deficiency in the payment towards fixed costs of the grid had to be made up by other customers. And I'll elaborate more on that in a moment. But the long and short of it is net energy metering that we have today, or NEM 2.0, which began in 2016, imposes on these customers, who are solar customers, a certain charge per month that is called a non-bypassable charge. Roughly $10 a month, but it does vary by customer. It depends on the amount of power they're consuming. And it's like roughly 2 pennies a kilowatt hour. So basically what you have with this non-bypassable surcharge is a payment of around $10 a month. And in addition, those customers have to be on time of use rates. So those are the two major changes that have been implemented with NEM 2.0.
Yeah, we should explain just time of use rates, since everybody, all home customers are now, I think, under TOU, time of use. Basically, between 4 o'clock and 9 o'clock in the afternoon and evening, the cost of electricity goes up significantly, whereas solar is generated mostly from 9 in the morning to about 4 in the afternoon. And so the idea here is that people will use less electricity in the evening because of the high prices. Whether that's actually happening so far is a bit unclear. So NEM started, I think it started back in the NEM 1.0 in the 1990s, right?
Yes, that's correct.
But at the time, of course, California did not have this massive renewable energy and electrification policy, in effect. So what was the reasoning at the time for doing this? Why did the state want to encourage solar?
Well, so the state of California is one of the most progressive states in the country. It wants to encourage energy efficiency. It wants to encourage clean energy. And it has had visionary people at the California Energy Commission and the state legislature. We have had governors as well who are very supportive. So I would say renewable energy at some point was felt to be an important part of the energy conversation by the visionary leadership that was there in California as well as elsewhere in the U.S.
Yeah, as I recall, that was just after the end of Jerry Brown's first terms in office. I know that when I moved to California in 1981, he was still governor. And he was, of course, very big on appropriate technology and things like that.
Yeah, if I can just add a quick comment since you brought it up. I was actually a graduate student in the late 70s working for 2 years at the California Energy Commission, which was an agency created by Governor Brown.
Yeah.
And, he was a visionary. He created that agency. That agency had authority to set minimum efficiency standards for appliances as well as buildings. And it really was a guiding force under Governor Brown's leadership to bringing a lot of these changes in state policy.
Yeah. Well, when NEM began, electricity costs charged by investor-owned utilities such as PG&E were fairly low. I can't remember what they were, but today those rates are among the highest in the United States. So, what happened exactly? Why did that happen?
So that's one of the big mysteries as to how. So first, let me state that the rates being charged. So there are 3 investor-owned utilities in California. The very highest rates are San Diego Gas and Electric's rates. Next is PG&E, and then it's Southern California Edison. Between these 3 utilities, we can easily say that they have the highest rates in the U.S. with the exception of Hawaii. Hawaii has absolutely the highest rates. And that's understandable given that they're an island. Everything is imported pretty much. I mean, they're still working hard to create wind power and solar power over there. For a long time, all of their oil, all of their energy was coming from imported oil.
Yeah.
So what happened in California is in many ways a big mystery to me. Despite being an economist, I have focused more on the consumption side of the equation and not on the supply side. There have been many, many smart people looking at the supply side, trying to do their best to minimize the rates. But as some of your listeners will recall, in the late 90s, there was a recognition that the rates were already very high and competition was going to be introduced to put some pressure on the rates. Well, the market that was designed exploded, as I think some of you probably recall, between the years 2000 and 2001. And that put a halt to customer choice. One utility went bankrupt, the other one almost went bankrupt. And then all of a sudden, we had a rate hike of 30% that followed because the wholesale contracts that were signed were not passed on through to the retail customers, and the crisis happened. And that's why one was bankrupt, the other one was nearly bankrupt. So ultimately, what the state ended up doing was creating a tiered rate structure to mitigate the impact on small users. And they put in place 5 tiers, with the lowest tier having the lowest rates, which were roughly half of what the rates were in the fifth tier. Fifth tier were the large users, people living in the Central Valley and warmer areas of the state. Well, eventually, things went out of hand. In the early 2010 period, they decided that a change was needed, but the problem was flattening the tiers was not going to solve the problem. The problem was the cost had just become exorbitant. And the question is that you asked me is why did the cost rise to be what it was? Well, part of it was the contracts they were signing. Part of it was the expenses associated with just running the grid. For some reason in California, those expenses seem to be a lot higher than anywhere else. And then, of course, as I'm sure we remember, we started having incidents like the wildfires. The gas side we had San Bruno.
Right.
All of that, in addition to just the rising inflation rates, et cetera, meant that our rates are now definitely not the envy of any utility in the country.
Well, let me ask you one question before we go to a break, and that is: have the rising rates cut into user consumption of electricity? I mean, that's what economics tells us, right? If you raise the price of a good, then people will use less. And I'm just wondering, I know California's electricity use has more or less flattened out until this new policy was put into place. But did that cut back on the amount of electricity that was being sold?
Absolutely, it did. It sort of eliminated load growth. So on a per customer basis, load growth has been flat in the state.
Yeah.
And that's partly because of the rising prices and partly because the Energy Commission has enforced very stringent appliance efficiency and building code standards. So basically usage has been flat and presumably will begin to decline at some point if this current trend continues. As we all know, rates are not going to stay flat. They're going to keep on rising by billions of dollars a year across the 3 utilities.
Yeah, we'll come back and talk to that after the break. We're going to take a brief break, okay? You're listening to Sustainability Now. I'm Ronnie Lipschutz, on the show with Brooke Wright. And our guest today is Dr. Ahmad Faruqui, a self-described economist at large. He hasn't always been at large. He recently retired from the battle group, but he's now doing work on various aspects of renewable energy and electricity rates and things like that. And I learned about him through a listserv in which I participate called the Electricity Brain Trust, where there has been a vociferous debate recently about the proposed decision that the California Public Utilities Commission is poised to make. So, Ahmed, last show I broadcast part of a clip from a show I did with Fred Keeley. And he explained how the private utilities in California went from being sellers of electricity to basically rentiers of electricity distribution You mentioned the transmission grid. And can you briefly explain what that meant and how that happened?
Right. So it was part of the restructuring that occurred in the late 90s in response to pressures to control the rising costs. The idea was generation would no longer be something that the utilities would be responsible for. They would largely become transmission and distribution utilities. For generation, they would sign contracts from private parties who would sell them the power. However, there were some exceptions. They were allowed to keep certain hydro facilities and, of course, nuclear facilities like Diablo Canyon. So it was a change that began in the late 90s, early 2000s, and at this point, I can say that the change has only been half implemented, because the other half was customers would have choice of provider. That really doesn't exist. It was frozen, as I said, after the energy crisis. And so by and large, what you have today is the following arrangement. For most customers, their utility provides them power as well as delivers it. So that includes generation, transmission, and distribution. However, in the last few years, even though we don't have retail choice, something else has come into the picture, and that's called community choice aggregation. This is the idea that communities like counties or cities can outsource their power procurement. So the utility will no longer provide the power. These communities will procure their own power, and the hope is they will have lower rates. The power will be more organic. It might be locally grown, and the hope is that ultimately people would be happier. So this is called the community choice aggregation approach, or CCAs. And CCAs are now spreading rapidly throughout the state. I believe roughly half the power that people are getting today is from CCAs. And the prediction is that in a few years, it might be 80% of the power coming from CCAs.
How is that working out? Because I know the CCAs buy power at wholesale rates, but consumers have to pay those transmission and distribution charges, right?
That's correct.
More than half of the bill.
Which is half of the bill, and the bulk of it is distribution, actually. Yeah, there's no way around it, and I just don't know what to make of it, because you would think with all the money being spent by consumers on T&D that we would have a better way to deal with power outages. Reliability would be better. We would not have these so-called PSPS events where your power is shut off for as many as 4 to 5 to 6 days, depending on the wildfire, scenario that's playing out. So it's been extremely costly on the one hand, and also very disruptive on the other hand. This arrangement isn't quite playing out the way it was supposed to, at least based on the last 3 years of data.
Yeah, and so PG&E is going to be asking for significant rate increases, right, to address shortcomings in the transmission and distribution systems. What is that going to entail?
So, it depends on which news media source you look at. I just have been looking at a $5 billion number that looks pretty real to me, that's coming into place. At least it has been proposed. Mm-hmm. And then soon after that, it'll be followed by an $11 billion number, and potentially about a decade out or so by a $20 billion number for undergrounding all the transmission lines. These are exorbitant amounts that have never been encountered by any utility in the history of the industry. I don't know how realistic they are, whether or not they will ever come to pass. But if they do come to pass, let's just assume for a moment that somehow they're all approved, the price of electricity will go through the roof. And I can't imagine that being a politically stable environment, let alone economically stable. It'll cause massive, all of this conversation about a cost shift today, right, between solar and non-solar customers, that will suddenly be forgotten, and the big issue will be the cost shift between customers and the shareholders of the utilities.
Yeah, we've talked about that before, about PG&E and Wall Street. I'm getting some kind of feedback here. And Well, let's talk about, first of all, that transfer from solar homeowners to non-solar customers. This is one of the arguments against the NEM 2.0, that something like $2 to $3 billion a year are going to fairly well-off people, and that cost is falling on people who are not terribly well off and pay a big fraction of their household income for electricity. I mean, can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, so basically that argument rests on the following contention. The contention is that each customer who's connected to the grid, regardless of whether or not they have solar, they impose a certain cost on the grid. They have a line coming from the pole to their house. They have a transformer on the pole, and then those wires go to a substation and ultimately to a transmission line and ultimately to a power plant. So those are fixed capacity costs that supposedly every customer has to pay. Well, but let's look at it this way. Suppose we look at a customer who's not a solar customer. That customer just lives in an apartment, or that customer lives in a very energy-efficient house. They might only be paying $30 a month to PG&E or SCE or San Diego Gas and Electric. So if the utility says, I need $50 from each customer per month to pay for this grid, then there are a large number of customers not paying $50 a month. They're paying $40, they're paying $30. I even know people who are just paying $20 a month, and they are not solar customers. So this contention was based on the premise that the solar customers under NEM 2.0 are paying only $10 or $20 a month. Well, first of all, that is not true based on data provided by the utilities in a data request to the commission. That number is almost $60 a month. The average solar customer in the NEM 2.0 is paying almost $60 a month. So this argument is kind of specious because it ignores all of the other customers who are not solar who are paying even smaller amounts. There is no concern for their cost shift. The concern is only about the solar customers' cost shift. And again, it's based, I believe, on incorrect numbers. I haven't dug into the data, but it seems to be you could come up with a $2 to $3 billion cost shift of 8 different kinds, depending on which cost shift you're trying to measure. The problem is the rate design is volumetric. In other words, cents per kilowatt hour, as opposed to a fixed charge. Mm-hmm. California only has a minimum bill of $10 a month for residential customers. Most solar customers pay a lot more than that minimum amount. So I think it's a little bit of a red herring to do this finger pointing at the solar customers kind of acting like robbers of the low-income customers.
Yeah. Well, there's that old line about lies, damn lies, and statistics.
There you go.
Right, and people have pointed out that there are other cost shifts that are going on, right? That indeed doing the decision to do that kind of thing is a policy decision which reflects political goals, right? And I mean, in this case, of course, it seems as though NEM was fantastically successful, right? And now success is sort of biting back. What's interesting about this, and people who look at their water bills see this as well. They cut back on water, and their water bills go up, and it has to do, of course, with covering the cost of fixed infrastructure and the organization. And I mean, that's more or less the same here. If consumption goes down and rates go up, it seems like that's a sort of self-defeating cycle, which is inevitably going to lead to, will it lead to the collapse of the private utilities? I know it's speculative, but...
Well, people have been talking about the so-called debt spiral that you just pointed out for about 2 decades now.
Yeah.
It hasn't quite happened, but I do believe we are now in a very different situation because customers have options that they didn't have 20 years ago. There are 2 options. One is energy efficiency. Energy efficiency has now become such a strong force that you don't have to be a solar customer to dramatically reduce your usage. You could just change all your light bulbs with LEDs. You can put in a smart thermostat and a new air conditioner and insulation. and your usage could go down by 30 to 50%. And that will create a huge issue of revenue deficiency for the utilities. They don't talk about it because politically they know it's not appropriate to criticize energy efficiency. That's an action that any customer can take, right? You can't stop them from doing it. So the finger pointing goes towards solar, partly because of what you said, that there is an impression that only the affluent customers are putting solar. One person even said that people who have solar are the ones who are likely to have offshore accounts. I mean, that's a pretty strong indictment of solar customers. They're doing it to lower their bills. These customers are typically larger than average customers who have overpaid their fixed costs for decades. Nobody's giving them that back to them, right?
Yeah.
So they have to do, and the technology, solar technology is now affordable, which it wasn't 20 years ago. So those, this has come up a lot, as you know, on the Electricity Brain Trust, the Google group that you mentioned. It's also come up in a lot of other conversations. That is grid defection likely to occur? In other words, a customer totally disconnects from the grid by putting batteries and solar panels on the roof. My view is it's still very expensive to do that. But maybe in 10 years, we might see grid defection on a large scale. If that happens, then that truly is the end of the private utility model. But I think it has still, a decade or so to go before it breaks apart.
Yeah, I've commented somewhere that it sounds a lot like the Jeffersonian model of the independent yeoman farmer, right? And and the 5 acres that, or whatever it is, that every individual should have. It does raise questions, of course, about the commonwealth and the common good. And as people point out, the grid isn't going to go away. But the question, I guess, is who's going to own and operate it. The last question I want to ask you during this segment is that, people are always saying, or at least the people we speak with, that rooftop solar contributes a number of benefits to the grid, but they're never included in rate cases and rate increases. So why is that?
That's a very important question. Rate making, unfortunately, is backward-looking. Mm-hmm. It's rarely forward-looking. And so what you have is you look at embedded costs. What did it cost to build a power plant, the transmission line, the distribution system, et cetera, and you base your rates based on certain somewhat, interesting formulas that some people would say are archaic because they do not look at the value of service that the customer is getting. Mm-hmm. You only look at the cost of service. There are a lot of value-added items that solar brings, one of which, right away, is resilience at the local level. If you pair your solar panels with a battery, you have backup power when it goes out. Number 2, you are creating clean energy and minimizing carbon emissions at the local level. And thirdly, if you have a surplus, that power is probably going to your neighbors. So you don't need big transmission lines all the time to convey that power from point A to point B. There are no thousands of miles here that you're talking about. They're literally hundreds of feet, in cul-de-sacs and courts and neighborhoods where this excess power is going. Those are all the value of solar dimensions that unfortunately are overlooked and not quantified.
I guess the basic problem is that electrons are difficult to differentiate. Let's get into the complexities of the PUC. So in December, one of the administrative law judges issued a proposed decision, quote, revising net energy metering tariff and sub-tariffs. And that's what we're calling the NEM 3.0 revision. So how do such proposed divisions get formulated? Where do they come from? Who provides the necessary information? And what is an administrative law judge? Maybe that's the place to start.
So on the last one, you got me there. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but I can tell you most of my career has been spent interacting with lawyers, and most of them have been either with utilities or with state commissions. So the way I have seen it working out is, as you know, commissions have commissioners. They are like the senior individuals at the commission. They make the decision, so to speak, at the end. But before they can make a decision, hearings are held, and usually the hearings have expert witnesses coming from the different sides, and the hearings are presided over by somebody who is an administrative law judge. There could be more than one judges, too. I've been in cases where there were two administrative law judges. Now, some of these judges are actual lawyers, but some of them are not. So they're not like judges in the, what should I say, the litigation sense of the term, like in a court case kind of a situation. My older daughter actually is a lawyer, and she was saying to me that you practice before ALJs, those are not real judges. I said, well, but those are the ones who are making important decisions. So in this particular case, what we have is the commission has to begin a proceeding. So a decision was made at some point that NEM 2.0 needed to be changed. And that decision, that idea to change, must have originated with many of the parties that usually are interacting with commissions, or maybe the idea originated in the commission staff or among the commissioners. I honestly don't know. I was not part of the case. But what I can tell you is at some point last year, actually in the middle of March, exactly the 15th of March, the Ides of March, different parties were invited to present their ideas on how to change NEM 2.0. And you had multiple parties presenting ideas. And again, as I said, I was not part of the case, but I have read the presentation, several of them. You had the solar industry, you had some of the environmental advocacy groups, like the Sierra Club, NRDC, and so on. And you had, of course, the utilities, free investor-owned utilities. Those ideas were presented, and then at some point, testimonies were invited from the different parties, and then hearings were held, cross-examinations took place. All of that was recorded. And finally, on the 13th of December, the administrative law judge who was presiding over the proceeding issued this roughly 200-page document with specific proposed changes. That document summarizes all of the activities that took place between March and December. So it has summaries of each side, and then it has summarization of the facts, and then there is a decision and as to why they have made the decision. It's a proposed decision, I should note. It is not the decision. That has to be made by the 5 commissioners. That has not yet been made. It was going to be made on the 27th of January, as we know, but it seems to have been deferred because of all the public pressure that's building.
Yeah, the governor is made noises about taking a look at this decision. It may be worth mentioning administrative law has to do with the regulations that executive agencies make, and the Supreme Court recently, in its ruling against the vaccine mandate by, I think it was by OSHA, basically said that OSHA did not have the administrative authority to make rules and regulations to impose that vaccine mandate. So this is not stuff that comes out of the legislature. It's stuff that comes out of the agencies, the regulations. And so there isn't litigation going on in the court. It's basically, as Ahmad says, hearings. And then I guess the ALJ goes into a room and looks at all of the stuff and makes a decision. It'd be interesting to know, how that process works.
They have a lot of staff. There's a lot of staff members working, behind the scenes with the ALJ.
Right.
And it honestly depends on the ALJ's temperament, their training. Everyone has a bias, right, one way or the other. They hire consultants. The commission hired consultants to help them look at the data. I think earlier you mentioned the cost shift of $2 to $3 billion a year. That estimate comes from one of their consultant studies. So all of that homework. But, if I can just make one comment on that.
Sure.
So I was here as an interested observer in this particular case. I have done NEM cases in several other states, but not here in California. And I should also mention that I installed solar and storage on my own house back in December of 2019. But what I was going to say is when I looked at what was presented in the middle of March by the different parties, particularly the utilities, I was stunned. It was so excessive that I had never seen that being done in any of the other cases in which I have participated, like in Kansas or Idaho or Nevada or Arizona or Montana or South Carolina. It sort of went 8 degrees further out than anyone else had gone out. It's 8 standard deviations, I should say. So I thought, honestly, when the proposed decision is going to come out, which it did in December, that it would be a happy medium between the different parties. Instead, it ended up being very close to one of the extremities, which surprised me because an ALJ's job is to be judicious. And this one, unfortunately, at least the way it came across to me, was malicious.
Well, what exactly does the proposed decision propose to do?
So it has a few major elements at a high level. The first is the imposition of a tax based on the size of your solar panels. They're calling it a grid access charge, but it really is a tax. So the more panels you put on, the more of a tax you will pay. So panel size is typically measured in kilowatts. And so if somebody has 7 kilowatt solar panels, which would be roughly 20 or so panels, they would pay $8 per kW times 7, so $56 a month.
Mm-hmm.
All of a sudden, in addition to what they were otherwise paying on NEM 2.0, which could be like the $60 number I mentioned, this would be added on top of that. So basically, it'll double their monthly payment. And this is true for new customers who would find it extremely uneconomic, therefore, to install solar, because if you're going to be paying $120 a month, why would you install solar if your bill previously was $150 or even $200 a month? You would just say, no, this is not appropriate for me. However, what's very amazing here, and that's where I meant malicious, is they want to also hit the existing NEM customers who thought they had a 20-year deal from the commission that the existing arrangements would continue. Now they're being told, it'll only last for 15 years. So a quarter of the life of their benefits just got sucked away of existing customers. I have never seen that being actually done in any state. It has been proposed in a few, but always rejected. Here, the commission is in the state, which is a very green and pro-renewable energy state. We have a mandate that there'll be solar panels on all new houses. We have a governor, Schwarzenegger, who set a goal of 1 million solar roofs, and we now have 1.3. So we have all of those factors that make California unique, and they have just been thrown under the bus and forgotten, and it's suddenly become this, put a tax. So that's the first thing, was putting the tax not only on the new customers, but also on the last 5 years of the existing customers. Secondly, they have said they're going to drop the export compensation that currently today occurs on a time-of-use basis, so you get less in the off-peak hours and more in the peak hours. They're going to drop whatever that number is by 80%. That's a humongous dropping, if you will. So these two, I would say, are, the biggest radical kinds of suggestions. And the first one actually has 2 parts. It is applying the tax, $8 per kW, even to existing customers. So that makes it, a twosome, if you will. So those are the 3 elements.
Mm-hmm. And who is supporting? I know you've mentioned this before, but who is supporting the proposed decision, and who is opposing it? I mean, what is the rationale for supporting this and for opposing it?
So the rationale for supporting it has been put forward by, of course, the 3 investor-owned utilities.
Yeah.
In addition, they have support from Kern, which is a group that supposedly represents the interests of low-income customers. And then there is the Public Advocate's Office, which is a state agency designed to also reflect the views of the general public, if you will. And finally, and this is the big surprise, at least for me, I was stunned when I saw this, an environmental group, the Natural Resources Defense Council, is supporting it. And in a sense, they have become the Natural Resources Attack Council. I just couldn't believe, and I know several of the people there, I just don't know. So I stepped back and I thought hard as to why are these groups doing what they're doing. And the contention they have is, rooftop solar is very expensive. solar is good. California wants to be renewable and decarbonize. The way to do it is to have large-scale solar, large-scale solar farms and transmission lines, because they keep saying that costs about 3 pennies a kilowatt hour. And this rooftop solar is going to cost a lot more. Well, the 3 pennies a kilowatt hour argument at least doesn't work for me, because I still end up paying close to 30 cents a kilowatt hour. So what good is that 3 cents if as a customer I'm paying close to 30 cents? So there's a lot of chicanery involved here, to use that term. So these are the groups supporting it. And the groups opposing the proposed decision, of course, are people who are in the solar business. But it is not just those groups who obviously are directly installing the solar panels and profiting. I mean, that's their business proposition. You have a lot of customers. 120,000 signatures were delivered to the governor opposing the proposed decision. Los Angeles Times, San Francisco Chronicle, Sacramento Bee, they have run editorials opposing the proposed decision. And I understand on the 7th of January, more than 1,000 comments were submitted, if I remember correctly, by people opposed to the proposed decision. So it has created a groundswell of opposition because of two reasons. One, people think that this is outrageous for a state like California, which wants to decarbonize and encourage electrification like heat pumps and electric cars, for that state to eliminate solar as an option. And pretty much that's what it will do, is the payback period with all of these changes proposed will become close to 20 years, not the 10 years that the decision mentions. That is based on erroneous calculations. The payback period today is between 7 and 9 years for most customers. Mm-hmm. The decision says, it's 3 to 4 years. Well, if it truly was 3 to 4 years, then wouldn't half of the people already install solar as opposed to just 10%? So I think a lot of factual errors and a lot of ideological bias is intertwined, and that's what led to this proposed decision being as radical as it is.
Well, I will say that in my view, the vast majority of Californians, don't know what is actually going on. However, if you tell them that solar is being stolen from them, then their ears will perk up. So, it's really a question, I think, of how complex the explanation is. We need to take another break. You're listening to KSQD 90.7 FM and ksquid.org, streaming on the internet. Well, you're listening to Sustainability Now. I'm Ronnie Lipschutz with Brooke Wright. Our guest today is Dr. Ahmad Faruqui, and we've been talking about the pending decision by the California Public Utilities Commission to alter the basis on which homeowners with solar rooftops are being compensated for the electricity that they put into the grid. Ahmad, what does this have to do? What might this have to do with the perilous state of PG&E's finances, and particularly its share value? Or is that too much? Is that too much out of left field?
Well, let's put it this way: there are many theories out there as to why the utilities, and as you know, it is not just PG&E, SCE, and San Diego. All three of them are unanimous on this issue.
Right.
And I think it transcends PG&E's finances, which admittedly are in dire straits. How would there not be, right? Which utility in their right mind would be doing half the things that they have done? I don't know if they were done accidentally or deliberately, but they have certainly proven their incompetence to us more than once. Mm-hmm. I am surprised the state has taken no real action to change their structure and their ownership patterns. But putting that aside, perhaps for another conversation, what I'm looking at here, I should mention, is California is no exception. Utilities throughout the country somehow have a mortal fear, a mortal dread of solar. They see it as putting them out of business. I don't know why that is the case. I think the progressive utilities will see it as an opportunity to help their customers lower their bills and provide them other value-added services to make up for the lost revenue. But instead, they're just seeing this as a threat. They see it as an arrow aimed at their heart. Anytime a customer installs a solar panel, panic spreads. Oh my goodness, one more. What should we do now? I think it is, unfortunately, what should I call it? Archaic thinking. I think in business, you have to accept change and get ahead of it. If you fight change, you're going to lose. Right now, California is not unique. Every utility, and I say that as somebody who consulted 2 utilities for years and years, until just this past December, whenever I would mention solar as an opportunity for customers and for the utility to work together, they would not buy that argument. If tomorrow they were able to rate base, in other words, earn a return on solar panels, like some of them are doing on energy efficiency investments by customers, they would become the biggest champions of rooftop solar. Mm-hmm. So right now, unfortunately, they see less revenue and less profits.
Yeah.
And therefore, it's enemy number one.
Yeah, and the shareholders in Wall Street are keeping an eye on that, I imagine.
They most definitely are. Actually, in the last couple of weeks, I have been talking to investors, to different investor groups about this topic, because the investor community is very concerned. On the one hand, what does this do to the solar industry? On the other hand, what does it do to the electric utility industry? Mm-hmm. Which company should they invest in?
Yeah. Listen, we're almost out of time, so I want to ask one last very big question. California has this ambitious goal of almost full electrification by 2045, and this will require closing down procurement of fossil fuel-generated electricity from both in-state and out-of-state generators. Do you think it's possible to achieve this goal of near-full electrification? What will it require?
It will require lowering the price of electricity. And I don't see any easy way to lower the price of electricity, right, with all of the rate cases pending. It's only going to go up and up. So the only way electrification, particularly heat pumps in houses and commercial establishments, they'll only become affordable if the customer has some other way of lowering their price of electricity. And rooftop solar is one obvious way of doing it. I just don't see how you can install a heat pump today in California's climate, which is ideal for heat pumps, but California's pricing climate of electricity is not. Mm-hmm. The only way to deal with it is to put rooftop solar on the roof. I have personally, as a customer, looked at installing a heat pump first for my space heating and then later on for my water heating. In both cases, the contractors that I talked to, they said, unless you have solar, you're not going to come out ahead. Your bills will go through the roof. Now I have solar, but not enough for a heat pump. I'll have to install some more panels. If I were to do that, then a heat pump becomes affordable. And that's not just me. It is true of most customers. So I think what the state needs to do is to accept the hard reality that solar is an important ingredient for decarbonization, and it cannot just be large-scale solar. It also has to be customer-level or rooftop solar, and therefore it should find ways to incentivize lowering the cost of solar, making the payback period affordable, not making the payback period 20 years and making it impossible for anyone to put solar. It would be self-defeating, in my view, from an electrification perspective.
Yeah, and I guess it also means the state needs to be much more proactive in financing solar for low-income households, because otherwise, the situation isn't going to change significantly.
Yeah, I personally think the state is fully in a position. I think we all know at the press conference that the governor had that the state has a huge budget surplus, and he's going to devote a good portion of that to decarbonization and clean energy. Mm-hmm. And I hope the governor develops a plan to lower the cost of solar for low-income customers. There's no reason why we shouldn't do it, and he has the money to do it. So that should put to bed this argument that somehow rooftop solar is going to be this reverse income transfer because 35% of the population would not be able to do it. Yeah, that's true. They have financial issues. They have credit standing issues. So why don't you just give a big rebate to them?
Well, thank you, Dr. Faruqui, for being our guest on Sustainability Now.
My pleasure. I really enjoyed the conversation, and thank you for having me on the program.
I should mention that I think there's a debate between Dr. Faruqui and Severin Borenstein, one of the foremost advocates for the proposed decision, this coming Wednesday afternoon. Is that still going on?
Yes, it is at 1 p.m., and Canary Media is putting it on. It'll be on their website.
Okay, well, Canary Media and I will post the link on the blurb for this particular show. And if you want to learn more about the decision, I've put some links on that particular announcement, and there is plenty, of course, in the newspaper. If you'd like to listen to previous shows, you can find them at ksquid.org, Sustainability Now, and Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Pocket Casts, among other podcast sites. So thanks for listening, and thanks to all the staff and volunteers who make K-Squid your community radio station. And so, until next every other Sunday, Sustainability Now.